Welcome to our interview with Jonathan Scelsa. Well, let's start off. Can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Hey everybody, my name is Jonathan Scelsa. I'm a practicing architect in New York City, and I'm an associate professor of architecture at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York.
Can you share with us some of the values of Pratt Architecture School?
Sure. It's a good question. Pratt Institute is historically an art college. It actually originally was founded under a charter of educating the middle class in the area of Brooklyn, although Brooklyn now is perhaps one of the more affluent boroughs of New York at the time of its founding in the early 1900s, at the turn of the 20th century, Pratt, the area was much more of a working community, and Charles Pratt set upon himself to create an institute that would be for those people. And so specifically, it's always been a really interesting place where we see the use of art and engineering coming together as a mechanism to empower people, and you thinking about design as a space of empowerment. And even today, I think the notion of design and design innovation in technique, in process, in form is something that Pratt really aspires to. And also, even more so, now Pratt is extremely interested in the questions of social justice, environmental justice, and climate, and really taking stewardship over the climate and setting it as the agenda for our next century.
That's amazing. We need a lot more of that stuff. You said you work at an architecture firm, correct?
I own an architecture firm in New York.
Can you tell us about some of the things you're working on right now?
Absolutely. We have a couple of different projects. Some of them are a bit more speculative, and some of them are a bit more real. We're working contemporarily on a master plan for a arts community in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And we are also working on a museum interior renovation in the Lower East Side of New York. Wow. And then in terms of the more speculative work that we're engaging in, we're working with aeroponics and looking at new types of aggregates and construction techniques that can bring farming and agriculture into not in a way that is dressing, shall we say, a building, but how we can deeply integrate them into the construction and structural processes. So that's more of the speculative work that we're currently engaging on in the office.
It's very interesting. So what were some of the hardest things you had to learn during architecture school?
So I remember when I was an undergrad at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And I remember one of the first, and I was actually not I did not take art classes in high school. Specifically, I did take art history in high school, but I was more of a music-oriented student. And normally, at the time, you would have to choose between those two realms of art. So I think one of the things for me, and it's interesting talking about the idea of teaching younger students, was the concepts surrounding abstraction were very confusing to me. And I think I had an appreciation of architecture and art from predominantly a different era than the modern era. And that was not a part of the art of education that I had really been a part of in my early childhood. So while I was extremely excited about technique and construction and materiality, and these were things that were super graspable for me, the kind of concepts surrounding composition and abstraction were always a bit more of a challenge in the early years of architecture school. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in that bridge, or that question of how can we reach out to students, for example, who didn't go through an inculcation about Western art, particularly those who are coming from other types of education, whether they be indigenous educations or whether they be educations that practice music my example. But I think we need to be able to understand how architecture doesn't need to stand on top of one type of niche. It's to kind of be something that is welcoming to many different areas. And while abstraction is certainly an important part because it allows us to break free from historical tropes as well, I think we need to make sure that we have a large tent that can bring many into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I feel like abstraction is something a lot of people do struggle with, including myself, who didn't grow up around with an art upbringing. So what are some of the personality traits of an architect?
You mean other than black t-shirts? That's you didn't prepare me for any of these questions, Christian. I think one of the things that architects can often be accused of is being control freaks. And I think that's because there's a required attention to comprehensive understanding of how things come together. At the same time, while there's a affinity for detail. So when one has to bridge between all of those scales, I think that's the reason why architects often become synonymous with megalomaniacs, because we're concerned with the whole and the parts, and they're equally integral in our thinking. So as opposed to, shall we say, only be thinking about the big picture and then letting someone else do the small things below us, or only dealing with this, which might be thought of as more of a developer, or someone who's only thinking about the small pieces and not thinking about the big picture, which would be more synonymous with a contractor. Mm-hmm. So I think that question of control is an interesting one. And perhaps another thing we should question as an architect of, do architects need comprehensive control, or are there ways that we can express ourselves in micro moments without that question, that challenge of full integration? But historically, I would say that the architect, as the quote unquote master builder, was given that responsibility, had that control, that discussion of control.
Wow, that was a very great answer. Do you have anything else you want to say?
Well, I mean, first off, thank you guys very much for the invitation to participate in this series. It's a great one. And I think it's really helpful to have more types of mentorship in both our field and in others. Just more conversations where people create one-to-one connections and understand what others are going through, I think is important. To that end, I guess the question that I have is, maybe Christian, what for you has been the most surprising part of your architectural education?
That's a good one. I think there's a lot of surprises in architecture education. And I think one of the big ones is learning about discipline and becoming fully consumed in a type of art that you really want to learn about and become, yeah.
Can you define discipline a bit more for me?
I feel like architecture is a discipline because you have to understand where you're at, and in terms of your creative process and how you can improve on it. And after that, you would have to learn and push yourself to reach those goals you have of improvements. A lot of that has to do with the time you put into school and studying, and not just that, just the stuff outside of school, by joining clubs and getting involved in projects that are not inside of school. I think a lot of that has to do with discipline because of the time you need to commit yourself to.
You speak about discipline in terms of the kind of sense of how do we discipline ourselves to educate ourselves deeper, right? Or to take in and absorb more about something we're interested in. or something we want to be good at. That's certainly one type of discipline.
Exactly.
I think in some respects that builds on the notion of also staying very clear to a focus path, and really questioning what is, I mean, there have been a lot of historical discussions on what is inclusive in terms of architectural discipline versus what is exclusive. And, for example, where one locates a door on a wall is 100% an architect's purview. It's not typically an engineer who's saying that door should be there versus there. It's the architect in negotiation with the city in terms of the fire movement and the kind of people moving throughout the space. But that is a problem or a challenge that architects can use one way or the other. So I do think one of the reasons why that's relevant even today is I think there's a lot of discussion on how can we do more and what is one profession's role versus how can one profession be cross-disciplinary. That is what you use a lot. How can we look across and and learn from each other, which is extremely valuable and important. But one of the questions becomes also how can we create very strategic action using the tools that we have at our disposal. So I think you and I were having a conversation the other day. Where, even think the example that I was using, locating a door in one way or another can actually be a political statement. Access to a space, does someone have less access to a space? Can you see into a space and therefore provides public oversight on that space? These kind of ideas, I think, and understanding what an architect has at their disposal allows one to be more political, more socially engaged, and more environmentally engaged. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to completely always ask for a new tool. There are a lot of great tools that we have at our disposal.
I agree. A lot of the social things that architects can do really can improve the health and wellness of people, I believe. All right, well, thank you. And I think that's going to be the end of this interview. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Christian.